All right, so this is our last week of new content. I can tell you're bummed, but because I know this is your last week of content, which means you're really working hard on your final project, you're really studying hard for your final paper, let's get this done as quickly as we can. Soren Kierkegaard did not think that we could come to understand or discover God by reason alone. He didn't think that reason was enough. Instead, what he believed was that God was so utterly transcendent, that he was so utterly other, that we couldn't even fathom him on our own. Now, I want you to juxtapose that with another figure from our readings this week, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who believed that God was very discoverable. He was very knowable because God was kind of in and among all the stuff. He viewed God more as an oversoul than a transcendent being. Now, for Kierkegaard, the key to discovering God was not in reason, but in what he called a leap of faith. The key to discovering God was by faith in Christ, which requires this non-rational leap, this non-reasoned leap involving the will. He emphasized the importance of the will rather than reason. And he also is known as the father of existentialism because he emphasized the individual over the society. And so he emphasized the idea of the individual so much so that it was the two words, the individual, that he wanted inscribed on his tombstone upon his death. He argued that we stand individually, not corporately, before God. Now, for Kierkegaard, he believed that we pass through three stages on our way to God. He said that the first stage that we walk through is the aesthetic stage. That's the stage where we just pursue pleasure. Our goal, our ends, our reasoning is for pleasure. It's very hedonistic in that sense. And he argued that that was good for a time, but ultimately we would find that utterly unsatisfying. That if we continue to pursue after pleasure, we would realize the simple emptiness of that pursuit. And because of that, it would create in us a longing and a hurt and a desire for something more. And it was that desire that would lead us to make a leap of faith into the next stage. The next stage after the aesthetic stage was the ethical stage. And it was in that stage where we, instead of just pursuing pleasure, humanity was pursuing these moral goods or moral goodness. Humanity, the individual as it were, would, instead of seeking his own pleasure, he would seek to be good. The problem was, in that ethical stage, in attempting so hard to be good and to meet an ethical standard, it reveals our own sin and it reveals our own guilt. And what's more, it reveals the lack of reason to live morally if you don't take another step and seek the thing behind or underlying that goodness. How do you define good? And so you have to take the leap into the next stage to be able to define that good. You see, he didn't buy into what Jeremy Bentham, another figure in our reading, bought into, this idea of utilitarianism, where pain is, or the avoidance of pain and the pursuit of pleasure is enough. Not only is it enough, but he would argue that is the most highest good. Kierkegaard understood that wasn't okay. So Kierkegaard argued that we needed to take another leap of faith. We needed to take another leap, and that was the leap to God. That was the leap to God. And he said you could only take that leap by faith and not by reason. You have to understand his in his time and in his era, his reasoning for writing the way that he's writing is he sees a spiritual decay and deadness in the Lutheran church in Germany at that time, and he's trying to describe what it means to be alive in Christ, what it means to have faith in Christ, that faith would do something, mean something, affect something in his life. And he argued that you can't do that by reason. We've lost our passion for God, he would say, because we've only loved gods with our minds, not with our hearts. Elsewhere, he says that truth is subjective, and some scholars have misunderstood and misinterpreted that statement as to argue that Kierkegaard didn't believe in objective truth. The reality is, his whole point was that truth is subjective. That's not a denial of objective truth, but it's an emphasis that belief and that assent affect the believer. That if I believe something, it has an effect on me. That if I assent to a truth, assent to a reality, then it affects the way that I engage with that reality. He can't then stand in the presence of someone who says that they believe in God, but it has no effect upon the way that they live. His time and his context help us understand his teachings. Now, very quickly, let's talk about his virtual contemporary. Nietzsche lived just a little bit after Kierkegaard, but let's talk for a moment about Nietzsche. Nietzsche is famous for I'm from Texas, so wherever other people say Nietzsche, I say Nietzsche. It's not okay. You should say Nietzsche. He's the one who claimed that God is dead. And his whole point was not that God was ever alive. His whole point was that the time for belief or faith in him is over. He argued that religion, specifically Christian religion, was only ever good in creating a slave morality. It subjected its adherents to a slave morality. And he argued instead that individual liberty, individual preferences, individual desires should rule. Now, he said ultimately not everybody's going to do that. Not everybody is going to chase after their own individuality and live an authentic life. Instead, he argued that maybe only one person would, or maybe a few people would, and those would be described as the Übermensch, or the Superman. Didn't mean for him what it means for us, not Clark Kent. But he's arguing that there's very, 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 very few people who will actually express their fullness of humanity and impress that upon the rest of the community. The rest of the community, the rest of society, he described as being the herd, and the herd was the majority of people who would not live their authentic lives. Now, that is important for us to understand because it determines how we will approach life, which is what I want to talk about next. Let's talk very briefly, and when I say briefly, I'm going to say this briefly. In your notes, I put this as ethics in a nutshell, but very briefly, I just want to describe to you the 5 different schools of ethics, the 5 different ethical systems. You have what's called virtue ethics, which asks the question, will this make me a better person? When they encounter an ethical dilemma, they ask the question, will this make me a better person? The emotivist ethical system argues, how will this decision make me feel? The utilitarian, the Jeremy Bentham, right? This is the what helps me pursue the most pleasure and avoid the greatest pain. It's really whatever works, right? You have the deontological ethical system, which actually says, is my action sufficient for someone to make a categorical imperative for the rest of the world? So am I doing, this will sound familiar, am I doing unto others what I would have them do unto me? Is the way that I'm behaving in this moment something? Is that revealing an ethical stance or a morality that I would want everybody else to follow? That's deontological. And then lastly is egoist or objectivist, which pretty much says, you do you. And so as you take your quiz this week, I want you to be sure you can match a term or a phrase with its thinker. So I'm going to cheat and I'm going to give you those terms. Now you just have to be able to identify who that phrase or who that term is associated with. The illative sense. Who is it that argued that there was a sense that allows us to infer something or to conclude something, and he called it the illative sense? Who talked about a leap of faith? I'll give you a hint. We talked about him at the beginning of this video. Who talked about a philosophic calculus? Now you're going to have to find that one on your own, but that's another person. Who talked about an oversoul? Again, mentioned in this video. Who talked about a Superman? And then lastly, who is it that said that theology was the study of the human awareness? I'll give you that one. That's Schleiermacher. And you're going to have a really hard time spelling that one, so I'm not going to make you. Friedrich Schleiermacher. His whole point was that all of religion was about man's dependence or his awareness of God. I hope that helps. Next week I'm going to try and put together a video for you that gives you some help as you prepare for your final. But do your reading, finish your reading. Let's finish this term strong. Finish your reading, write your paper, and I'll see you next week.